Our gospel today is from Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came and when he saw Jesus, fell at his feet, begged him repeatedly, "My daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed Jesus and pressed on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, had spent all that she had. She was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Tabitha, come," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this time they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of the Lord. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord our God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So today we have stories of healing, but the first reading is one from Lamentations. How much time do you spend in Lamentations? It might be someone's favorite book of the Bible. I prefer the Psalms. They have plenty of laments there. But Lamentations has one little section in chapter 3 where the good news is proclaimed. And the rest of Lamentations is lament. It's lament. And so the only piece we pull out for a Sunday morning every 3 years comes straight out of that really wonderful reassurance. But maybe in this time and this day, maybe where you are at this moment, you wish we would have read some of the other. The Psalms are full of laments. The Old Testament is full of lament. But Lamentations especially was written at a time and a place where the people had suffered and endured and suffered and endured and suffered and endured, and just could not imagine where the help was going to come from. It's a tough thing when you're feeling that, when what you have won't go away. when whatever condition you're suffering from, be it physical, spiritual, psychological, it's not going to end. There's not an end date. We like to say, well, you'll get over it when something tragic happens, but we don't ever get over something. We learn from it, we grow from it, but it's still there in our hearts. It lasts through things over and over again for us, and it stays with us. And especially if we can't forget it because it's so in our face. The good news is that God is here. It is the right verse to pull out of Lamentations. The one to remind us that God is here. The Psalm, I love Psalm 130, has so much to remind us of the graciousness of God, and that we call and cry to God, and God hears our voice. God is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. 2 Corinthians talks about us being faithful. And when I went to Iceland, I took a couple small books with me. Thin, lightweight. But this was one of them. And this was something I really liked. It's called Simple. These are observations for pastors. Following the word is effortless and simple. But your people will prefer harder, more complicated ways because they carry the illusion of productivity. You will be able to tell when the balance is shifted. There'll be an increase in activity and a decrease in thoughtfulness. There'll be an increase in effort and a decrease in peace. There will be an increase in exciting programs and a decrease in wise and simple people. There will be an increase in talking and a decrease in listening. Stay pure. Stay simple. For this is the way of the word. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, you began this thing last year, it's time for you to finish it. Whatever it is that you had started, it doesn't matter what you have, it doesn't matter how little you have been given enough. God calls you to finish the things you started. They're just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful lessons. We could have had a whole sermon on any one of the three of them, but I tell you, you just can't give up Mark's message for the girl returned to life. There's not much better news here. The Gospel of Mark has some very interesting things, and one thing that it does a lot, the Gospel writer combines two stories, and the two stories give heed to each other. They tell about each other when they come in together. So we have the story of the little girl who's 12 years old and sick and dying, and the leader of the synagogue who begs him to come to heal her. And he goes. Now, Jesus could have healed her at that moment, right? But he didn't. He follows along. He's interrupted. The woman who has gone through every penny she has, gone to see every doctor she has, and she has been just suffering. And how long has she been suffering? For 12 years. So she's been suffering for 12 years as a 12-year-old girl. Mark does this. He also loves the word immediately. You'll notice it happened twice. Immediately, Jesus turned to hear and see and wanted to know who touched his cloak. Well, he knows everything. Why didn't he know who touched his cloak? He didn't intend to heal her. He didn't see her in the crowd as someone who needed to be singled out at that moment. All the crowd wanted stuff. They all had things that they were seeking to find by following Jesus. They brought their friends. It wasn't so much that they were listening, but they were wanting. And maybe they were wanting political overthrow. Maybe they were wanting the church, to be better about being church. Maybe they want, but many of them came to be healed. And the one who touched him was healed. She was healed from 12 years of suffering. And more than that, she was restored back to community. If you're hemorrhaging, female hemorrhaging, we're not expecting that, she had a cut in her arm and she was bleeding out, right? A woman who's hemorrhaging this is a female thing. Guess where you were during that time? Alone. People had to cook your meals for you. You couldn't cook for your family. During those days, you were ritually unclean. And so you had to stay away from everyone else. And if that's 3 or 4 days a month, maybe that's a nice little break. But if that's for 12 years, you can imagine that the thought of taking care of you went sour pretty fast along the way. And figuring a way to simply leave you stuff was so much easier because, after all, you're unclean. And I have to go through all kinds of things if I do so much as give you a hug. So she had been living outside of community. Exactly the opposite of the 12-year-old girl who was beloved by her parents and the whole community. They all showed up to mourn. The wailing and all of that is what happens, and it happens for days. That they come and they support the family, grieve for them almost. Anyone who has lost someone so close might know that you don't even have tears in the beginning. But it's kind of nice that other people are crying for you. That they've come to support the family in this way. And the child is dead. And they say, you don't really need to bother him, because he can't do anything now. But he can. And he did. He said she's not dead. You just think she's dead. And maybe they did. The technology we have today, how we determined, maybe she wasn't. Maybe she couldn't awake, and she'd been so sick for so long that her breathing was so shallow they were even missing it. And they knew it was her last, and they called for the mourners. But she wasn't gone. And he brought her back. He brought her back and restored her. Did he tell her to go downstairs and go outside and see? No, what did they say? Very practical. Very, very practical. Give her something to eat. She hasn't eaten in days. Right now, that's what she needs. She needs, right now, something very physical. She doesn't need the crowd. She needs her parents. She needs to eat. And she was given new life. A life in the family, in the community that was going on beyond this day. Jesus restores us and heals us in new ways. Sometimes because we are reaching out and touching that cloak. And sometimes because someone else is doing the praying. Did the little girl say, I really think if you bring Jesus, that it'll all turn out okay? No, she had no voice in this. No voice at all. Her faith wasn't needed in this. Sometimes we think that it's our job to do everything. And especially if we feel like we don't have enough to do it. We're of the lesser, not of the greater. So of course, my talents aren't as much. I can't do as much as all these wonderful people I know. And I could name something each of you could do that I can't do. And if you're focused on what you can't do, instead of recognizing that God has given you enough, it's easy to put off what you started. and say, I just don't have the energy, the strength, the capacity, the wisdom, the money. Oh yeah, the money. Are we worried about money? I think we are. I think we're always worried about money. Even when we have more than we need, we're worried about money. I met with Matt Sebastian this week a couple times. Matt said, the things that men worry about most is that their wives could live to be 130 and would need the money to support them all that way. He said that's what retired men are most concerned about. More than the taking a vacation, living our life, is the what if she, we're getting older and older. Not what if, what do I need? But what if the needs of my beloved aren't going to be met? What is going to happen then? We do worry about what we don't have. And God says, I've given you enough. As we reach out and pray and ask for healing, let us remember that Jesus is enough. Amen. Gracious God, lead us, guide us, bring us and restore us into community in new ways. Let us follow you and be simple. Trust in your word. Amen.